Everyone okay? Ready to roll? Anyway, welcome everyone and to another planning committee. We've got two items on the agenda and we've been asked, so if it's okay with you, that we swap around and we do item 4 first. Because the Steve Smith, the officer, who's actually on holiday, believe it or not, has very kindly joined us for this afternoon. So that would release him. So away we go first. Anyway, first item is apologies for absence.
From Councillor Paulette Smith, that's all, Chairman.
No others? Okay, well done. Cheers. Item 2 is disclosures of personal and prejudicial interests. Are there any? No, on the Gower AONB, I've been on the Dark Skies meetings, so should I declare?
Being very general.
It's just I've been there, yeah. Okay, and chair of AONB.
Yeah, they're doing.
I declare that if that's all right. Okay. So right, let's move on to item 4 then, is the new supplementary planning guidance, the revised Gower AONB design guide. Who started?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good afternoon all.
Thank you, Tom.
There are 2 reports before members today, as has been explained, but they relate to 3 separate SPG documents. All of them are at draft consultation stage, because we're at the point where we want to go out to engage more widely with stakeholders and all interested parties, really, to feed into the documents. So the purpose today is to set out why approval is required for each of those documents, and so that we can get on with that consultation process. That in itself is going to be a challenge. I'll come that consultation because of the environment we find ourselves in the COVID situation. So I'll return to that later on. But initially, if we start with the AONB design guide. This is a document like the trees SPG, which is actually already in existence. But there are a number of reasons why, given the changing context, it is important at this point to update the document, and in the case of the AONB design guide, make some quite significant changes to it. In the last 10 years since the initial version of the design guide was adopted against the UDP, the planning framework has changed quite significantly. We have adopted the new development plan for Swansea last year, or in fact 18 months ago now, 2019. Also, there's been some quite significant changes to Planning Policy Wales and to the technical advice note on design, and also some legislative changes. All of those needed to be reflected in this revised version of the SPG. One of the most significant aspects has been this key principle of placemaking. It's really emphasised in national guidance, but members will recall when we debated the LDP and when it was adopted, it's really at the heart of that development plan. We just go to the next slide there, Andrew. It's relevant at all areas of Swansea and at all scales, and this is where it's quite significant, because in some ways it's easier to get heads around placemaking in terms of an urban environment and in terms of some of the larger developments that come forward. Committee was obviously presented with the Park Mall scheme, strategic site last week, and there's an understanding of how, when we're building new neighbourhoods, placemaking is at the heart of that. But you know, it's a concept that's important, as I say, at all scales, and because this is really about more than just aesthetic elements and architectural uplifts to properties. This design guide is all about trying to instill that vision of placemaking, how buildings are used, how places are experienced by those that live within them and those that visit them, the open spaces between buildings, the mixture of uses, everything really that influences how people experience a place. We needed to weave that much more significantly into the AONB design guide. It's a document that's been very well used by planners since the initial one was produced, so say back in 2011. It's referred to consistently not only by the department in its decision notices, but by the planning inspectorate as well. So it has been successful in managing change over that time period and of giving the planning department, the local planning authority, a tool to be able to preserve that special character of the AONB. Now, there is going to be continued pressure for development. We know that's historically been the case. There's no change to the planning framework which suggests there is going to be any less desire for certain types of development across Gower. And in fact, we have some allocations within the plan as well that will encourage development on certain sites. So it's a very important document on that basis, because we know that we are going to need to have this additional guidance to be able to inform our decision making. It's also going to be useful in terms of being able to do away with some older SPGs. Now, we've got some that are going back to the early 80s, covering, in particular, there's 4 separate documents covering the issue of chalet developments. All of those can be integrated into this guidance. There is now a separate module that deals with chalet development. There is also an opportunity to bring in a lighting guide module that is important for the work that we are doing in terms of the seeking accreditation for Gower to be recognised under dark skies. And there are also some separate guidance available on advertising, a bit of a technical area, but again, it's just a separate document we don't need to have. We can bring it into this as being a one-stop shop for developers. And this is what it's about, really, providing clarity for developers, providing a framework that enables us to reach consistent decisions. So on the next slide, this just provides a visual aid, really. There's all sorts of different types of development pressure we're likely to be dealing with as a planning authority and as a committee. It will range from small scale extensions to more significant housing development on allocated sites and exception sites on the edge of settlements, the reuse of existing barns for employment purposes. We often get the image at the top left there is an aerial of one of the chalet sites, which is Sandy Lane, and again it's a very unique part of Swansea's heritage, some of these developments, and there's a number of them scattered around the Gower, and we need to have up-to-date guidance to enable us to continue to preserve their unique nature. So just as on the next slide, this is the list of the SPGs to be replaced, as I mentioned, and on the next slide, a reminder really of what's the key aim of it, what is the objective of this document. This is all about ensuring that future development doesn't undermine and detract from this very special landscape, the thing that makes Gower pretty special and attracts visitors to it and makes it the attractive area that it is. It's very much, as I say, about emphasising placemaking and making clear what the specific design objectives are and the sorts of considerations that developers need to have regard to when they're coming forward with their schemes. And the document is set up in all different sections, from covering residential, agricultural development, tourism development, a whole range really of the sorts of schemes that we're likely to see. And you know, it's important to say that this isn't about setting out a document which, you know, restricts any form of development happening in the future. We want to support the right kind of schemes on Gower. There has been some really good examples of development since that first design guide was produced, and we want to capitalise on that. We want to be able to have a framework that can be referenced to resist those applications that we know are going to detract from the AONB, but really actively support those that are going to give it a sustainable future. So on the next slide here, this is just an overview really of the sections within the report. I've set out 3.1 to 3.10 of the report. These are some of the key areas that have been either refreshed significantly or are fundamentally new modules within the guidance. As I say, that includes aspects on residential chalets and a lighting guide, but there's also new assessments done of certain villages within Gower, certain villages that didn't benefit from that kind of character appraisal previously. There are sections on landscape assessment. There is a more relevant overview of what the current DM process is, development management process is, for when we're taking applications through from early pre-application stage and right through the process. And obviously we are looking to encourage dialogue with developers at a very early stage. At this point, I think it is useful just to reflect on some of the residential aspects in particular. Steve, as we mentioned earlier, Steve Smith should be on the call, and he will be able to pick up on some of the real life examples then over the last few years of where the guide has been useful, where the guidance has been very important in the decision-making process.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Tom. Just a couple of slides from me. Yeah, the key message is obviously Gower is a very special, a very magical place, and as local planning authority, we have the challenge and even the privilege of helping to shape development across such a wide area, from these very precious rural landscapes right through to the large-scale city developments. I don't think there's another council in Wales that has that degree of variety in its planning functions. And the other key thing is, I've just been thinking back across recent planning committee agendas, and I don't think many applications from Gower really come before planning committee, typically because they tend to be quite small scale, and or they don't meet the triggers for coming to planning committee. The one that does come to mind will be the houses in Panard, which was about 6 months, maybe nine months ago. So it's very helpful to sort of try and explain kind of what kind of developments fit into this design guide and how this design guide doesn't stop change. It helps to shape this change. So as Tom said, placemaking isn't just an urban concept. It's for all areas, rural, urban, at all scales, from single properties, extensions to single properties, right through to some of the bigger developments, arenas in the city centre. So yeah, the existing Gower Design Guide, very, very, very successful, very well used by officers, and not just by developers. Often it might just be a householder development. So it's somebody who doesn't necessarily have an architect, have a designer. They're trying to look at the guidance, and often perhaps neighbours or concerned people who are looking to object to an application and looking to sort of find the relevance of the planning guidance for their area. The key thing is it sets requirements for scale, i.e. not overly large developments that sit comfortably in the landscape, and quality. It doesn't prescribe a one-size-fits-all approach, and certainly does not stop innovation. There can be some very contemporary developments in Gower, or some very traditional developments in Gower. And I can reflect on this really positively, because my team was involved in negotiating schemes way before this first version of the design guide was in existence. We helped write the first version. We've been using the current version, and we've helped to update the amended version that's before you today for permission to go out for public consultation. So we're very well versed in using this document, understanding it and all its nuances. So could we go on to the next slide, please? This is just literally, it's a very, very long document, and it's appended to your reports. One page here, just to explain, it's a very visual document. It's very clearly structured in terms of all the different kinds of development, whether it's householder development, whether it's residential development, whether it's commercial development, all these sorts of things. This is an extract from the residential section, and it differentiates between residential development within the designated villages or in the open countryside. Obviously, open countryside is a lot more sensitive and has certain extra criteria. Generally, open countryside development involves knocking down an existing property that may be of no architectural merit and replacing that with something better quality. You know, relatively sort of succinct text is the key thing to note. Lots of graphics and lots of clear sort of criteria to help guide the way designers or people who are thinking about these developments can do them. Next slide, please. So this is an example of the kinds of things that fit within the Gower Design Guide. This, I'm sure you'll all know it, is the really amazing extension on Fairy Hill, which, as well as being in the Gower AONB, so obviously the design guide has been applied to this development. It is also an extension to a Grade 2 listed building within a designated historic park and garden. So there's lots of sensitivities here. We worked really closely with the applicant, initially from a scheme that was not acceptable to this scheme that's been really, really well received as the wedding venue there. And it shows that these very good quality contemporary approaches can really fit within the design guide. It's all about getting the scale right, getting the quality right. So it's certainly not saying it's in the rural area, it's got to be traditional. Next slide, please. So this is a development known as Stormy Castle, which is just up above Llanmaddock. This was actually, I think, had been approved at planning at the time of the previous, or the original design guide, but hadn't been built. So there's some artist impressions. This has now been completed. This is a picture of the completed scheme from the architect's website. This again is an overtly contemporary scheme, retaining some of the kind of stone outbuildings and building a very, very bold addition to that, which has won national architectural awards. Again, certainly the design guide would not stop innovation, and this kind of approach done with this kind of quality would certainly be endorsed by the Gower Design Guide. Next slide, please. This is the kind of middle ground for the design guide, the approach that's known as contemporary vernacular. So this is a development down in Llangeneth, I think. And this is an example of generally using quite traditional forms, so pitched roofs with more contemporary materials. In this instance, it's got stonework, but quite a modern roof. So this it's not prescribing that everything has to look traditional, and this is a way of updating that for modern ways of living. And the last slide. But there is another approach to the Gower Design Guide, and you'll recognise this. This is actually a visual from the Panard Drive housing scheme of 60 or so new houses. If developments are going to go traditional, to do traditional well. So that was part of the issue prior to the original design guide, was we had a lot of developments that we would call as being placeless, that they weren't related to the Gower character, or they were too individual buildings were too big. So what we've been able to do is kind of distill down those characteristics that make Gower special, and the design guide conveys that. So if you are going to do a development such as this with like cottagey type houses, it allows us to do them really well. And this development, which was approved a while back, has got that sort of of Gower Lane concept with stone walls, grass verges, the painted stones. So it's not just about the buildings, it's about the whole entire place. And also at the far end of that visual there, you can see there's more contemporary low energy developments, but by Rounded Developments, who are based in Gower, sort of self-build local materials. So what the main message is the Gower Design Guide certainly does not stop change, but it makes sure we've got the right development for this very special place. And that's all I was going to say for now. So I'll hand back to Tom. Tom, I think you're muted.
Well, that's with one, isn't there? There we go. Yeah, so I'm just going to finish off. Thank you, Steve. Finish off with a reference to the consultation process, because there is going to be a bit of a unique challenge around dealing with COVID restrictions. We'll need to be adaptive to that. We'll need to be flexible on it. There's a lot we can do, obviously, in terms of doing stuff electronically. We have a standard procedure, standard range of methods in place for using email, targeted email, holding sessions with key stakeholders. Don't necessarily have to be physically within the same room. They can be on these kinds of calls. We have a targeted survey produced, which will identify certain parts of the document, ask key questions of people. We obviously have the websites, we have media articles, and there's also all the social media. So there's a lot we can do, but we still want to get out there and be able to talk to people as well. So subject to being permissible within the regulations, then yeah, we'll get out there with perhaps with a bit of social distancing and do some events in the community itself. So we've got to play a bit of a waiting game on that to see what's permissible within the regs. But we certainly want to get on with things and have a consultation as soon as possible, really, during September and October. So that's that. Obviously, we can. There'll be a vote on approving this, but before we get to that, I would invite any questions from members on what they've seen today.
Hello. Yes, Mike Lewis here, Councillor Mike Lewis. I have one question. Can you hear me, Tom?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. I noticed that there's a piece within the SPG or proposed SPG for residential chalets. Will the 10-month occupancy rules still apply? Hello?
Okay. Chair, would you like me to deal with things individually, or just take a bunch together?
Okay.
All right, you're muted, Chair.
Yeah, we'll come back, Tom. All right, we've got Councillor Will Evans and then Mike White.
Okay.
Just a quick query from me, Tom. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, that's fine, Councillor.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Is there anything in this revised plan covering caravan sites, not traveller caravan sites, but obviously domestic tour type sites? Is there anything in the revised guidance covering that?
Okay, we'll come back to that. Mike White, Councillor Mike White.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a question, perhaps could be included within the guidance, Tom. In regards, because of the sensitivity of the Gower itself, what about if somebody goes in and starts to build before actual permission is given? Can anything be perhaps incorporate into the policy to make developers aware of that and what actions will be taken?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Mike. That was it.
It joined slightly late.
Right, Councillor Lewis, Councillor Richard Lewis, did you want to make any comment, being as it's your ward? And I got Councillor Cyril.
Yes, I'd like to make a comment. I mean, obviously, was it, Will Evans asked, Mike White about the caravan sites.
Yeah, you're happy with that, yeah?
Well, I'm concerned that.
Yeah, but that was your question. Yeah.
It was. I'm concerned that are there any major changes, because the thing is we've got enough caravan sites in Gower at the moment. We tried one in Skirlage, which was for an overspill. That ran for 3 years, and in the 3 years they didn't even have a caravan. So I suspect that there will be more caravans coming down to Gower in the future, because a lot of people are going to stay in this country rather than going abroad. And I think a lot of the caravan sites now, and especially the ones which are that we're quite fortunate, most of the caravan sites are run on a very good quality. And I think that is what we want to encourage, because at the end of the day, it brings in a lot more money. And Gower, when you look at it, the way I saw the picture of Ferry Hill, I mean, the wedding industry brings in over 20 to 25 million a year, and the rest of the Gower then brings in something well over 100 million. So this is probably it lays the golden egg for Swansea City Council. I don't think there's any other ward in Swansea that brings in this sort of money, but I think we have to treat it carefully. And what I am saying, I just feel that these days the committee should, in fact, I'm not satisfied with the size of the committee. I think it's too small, and I think that we should look at going back to the old ways, which I thought were much better.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Anderson.
Yeah, going on from Will Evans's question, will there be anything in this report regarding camper vans, going on from caravans to camper vans, like say on Portainen or somewhere like that?
Yeah, okay. Cheers. Councillor Des Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Following on from the local member, we've got to realise this is going out for consultation. We're not changing the policy for next week. I know it's likely to be a staycation time this year, but this is for future years and so on. So, there's no reason why we shouldn't say no to going out to consultation. And it'd be very interesting to hear what other bodies have to say, like the Gower Society and so on and so on. Yeah. When it comes back, we'll make a decision on it eventually.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Any other hands to go up? No. Can't see any. Right. Thank you, Thomas. Back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I will. I'll just deal with them in order. There's three main areas. On the first element, on the residential chalets, those that are restricted to 10-month occupancy are not really covered by those that are listed in the design guide. Those in Sandy Lane, in Holtsfield, Hareslade, they don't have that kind of minimum occupancy. The ones that do, the 12-month ones, have much less significance in terms of their value in heritage terms. They don't have that kind of legacy there. They have a different kind of form. So it's not an issue for those that are covered by the sites listed in the design guide. In terms of this whole issue of camping and caravans and camper vans, even, it's such a significant issue on Gower, and we recognise that. We drew attention to it in the report on paragraph 1.21 there, where it does highlight that the guide won't contain and doesn't contain specific guidance relating to caravan and campsites, and that in fact there will be separate guidance produced for those existing sites, because I think the point's been made by members here that really our effort should be put into successfully managing existing sites, and that's what our policy framework in terms of the LDP is seeking to do. It's a very prescriptive set of policies that are set out in the new plan in the LDP that deals with this issue, and it's very much about recognising the constraints that there are on Gower, and the landscape assessment work that has shown that really the opportunities for encouraging tourism to this kind of site should be, well, what can we do to improve the existing sites. I think the third point then was in relation to building before permission given. This is something that there is a section in the guidance on the development management process. So we do set out there quite a clear process for the applicant to go through from very early stages of approaching the planning authority to discuss the proposals, where we encourage the formal pre-application discussions between parties, and then where we would take them through the planning application. So there are, of course, established procedures in place for where anything does happen without consent. But yeah, it certainly is the intentions of the document to contain that section for the benefit of applicants to be able to read how they go about this process of applying for planning permission and what they can and can't do.
Okay. Another hand has gone up there. Councillor Mary Jones.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It was just when they were talking about camper vans and things. Can I, I'm assuming that the airport is covered by separate guidance, or does what can be permitted on the airport come under this draft design guide?
Yes, I mean it's a location on Gower, so it will be, applications would be considered for whatever the scheme would be, whether it's beneficial in association with the existing airport or any other redevelopment scheme. We would this is guidance that is used across the whole of the Gower, and in actual fact, it's probably worth highlighting that it does apply to some sites on the edge of the AONB as well, because there needs to be that recognition that some developments by their nature may not be within the designation boundary, but they can have a significant impact on the area itself by way of affecting its setting, really depending on the scale and the nature of the development. But it's made clear within the document that it can be used for those applications that lie outside the designated area.
Okay, well, thank you. Right. No other questions? No? Okay, well, unless anyone else wishes to come back in. No? You can see the recommendation there is before us, is that we approve the draft SPG for the purpose of public consultation and further stakeholder engagement. So we'll now, unless anyone else wishes to speak, take a vote on that.
Yep. Councillor Cyril Anderson.
Approve.
Peter Black.
Approve.
Will Evans.
Well,
Councillor Will Evans.
voted. You voted well.
Yeah, approve.
Thank you.
Louise Gibbard.
Approve.
Mary Jones.
Approve.
Mike Lewis. Councillor Mike Lewis. You're muted.
Sorry, I was muted. Approve.
Councillor Richard Lewis.
Approve.
Paulette Smith's absent. Des Thomas.
Approve.
Lloyd is absent. And Mike White.
Approve.
and
myself.
and yourself, Chairman.
Thank you. Right.
That's unanimous then.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you all for that. And we look forward to that going out to consultation and getting the feedback. So, right, let's revert back to where we would have been. Is the item 3 is the new supplementary planning guidance, development and biodiversity in trees, woodlands and hedgerows. And that's consultation drafts as well. So we'll be back to Tom and then Rachel, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Chair. So as I mentioned earlier, what we'll do here is run through the presentation for both of the remaining SPGs, the development and biodiversity, and also the trees, hedgerows and woodlands document. I think it'll be useful to do both concurrently like that, because there is such an integral relationship between both SPGs.
Yeah.
And of course, once I've done that with Rachel, then members will be able to ask additional questions on these documents as well. So similar to the AONB design guide, the trees on development sites document is already in existence, but it's very important to update that to bring it up to reflect changes in national standards and to ensure that it is appropriate aligned to the LDP. But I will start with the development and biodiversity document. There's been some really significant changes. If we go to the next slide here, significant changes to national guidance and legislation on this whole issue of integrating biodiversity matters and green infrastructure issues into the planning process. Members will, I'm sure, have heard these terms used a lot in dealing with applications that have come before committee in recent months. So this document is a really innovative piece of guidance, and it is at the vanguard of this key theme in planning practice. The wider legislative landscape, as I say, has changed quite dramatically. We've had the Environment Act come forward. We've had the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act established for a while now. But PPW, Planning Policy Wales, which obviously provides an overarching framework for all development plans in Wales, now has some quite significant and direct references to the need for biodiversity to be enhanced and to for net benefit to be delivered in association with development proposals. And decision makers, developers, are all getting their heads, private sector, public sector are all getting their heads around the impact and the implications of that, and have been over the last, I'd say, 18 months to 2 years. This guidance is really important in that sense, because it spells out exactly how developers need to go about ensuring that their development provides for those kind of benefits that we will be seeking. So it in the same way as the other ones, it will go out to consultation and invite feedback from a wide range of stakeholders. Before we get to that stage, obviously we need to have this this approval today. But I will say that already, before we've embarking on this stakeholder process, producing the draft document has been a real one council approach, and strategic planning officers worked with development control officers and had some really important input from the council's ecologists and biodiversity officers to produce what is I acknowledge to be a very large document. The appendix is pretty technical, because this is a technical area in some senses in terms of all the requirements that developers are required to have regard to. But we certainly have, in terms of the core document, we certainly have tried to keep that to something which is legible and which is usable to the development industry and to the decision maker, so that they are, as I say, a lot clearer about what they need to do to be able to meet their requirements in terms of these biodiversity elements. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to my colleague Rachel Willis, who has led on this work and is really excellently placed to take you through what she's produced in terms of this draft document, working in collaboration with other council departments.
Right, okay, thank you, Tom. Hello, Rachel.
You need to unmute.
Sorry, classic.
Okay.
I thought a really useful place to start would be to remind ourselves of just how special the environment is in Swansea. I know Steve's already touched on that in terms of the built environment, but I know every time Deb Hill makes a presentation, she reminds us of the fact that 80% of the county's land area is our natural environment. Over half of our area has a significant ecological designation. So the slide just kind of gives you a snapshot of that. We've got really international designations, national designations. Of course, there's Bury Inlet, which is a Ramsar. We've got Natura 2000 sites, 35 SSSI. So when a development application comes in, it's highly likely to affect either a habitat, species or site of quite significant importance. But another thing I wanted to highlight is I think everybody's quite aware that there's a complex framework of legislation that lies behind all these designations. So one thing that we've had to provide guidance on, and hence why we've got such a technical appendix to this plan, is all of those things that a developer will have to consider. The separate environmental legislation to do with protected species and habitats. So that's one element of what we should be thinking about when we're talking about biodiversity and ecosystem resilience. But also the way that, as Tom said, legislation has evolved, we're now talking about ecosystem services, ecosystem resilience. So we don't want to be just thinking about sites and habitats in isolation. We need to be zooming out to start to think about how these things work together. So the concepts that come out when you talk about ecosystem resilience are things like green corridors, stepping stones, role of these parts of the landscape that provide habitats maybe for protected species. There's pocket woodlands, hedgerows, of course, could be a corridor that allow species to maybe forage or migrate, and all of this goes together to help us make planning decisions that will give us greater biodiversity and ensure that the habitats that we create or retain through a development decision are able to respond to habitat climate change. So it's a really important point to note that this SPG is thinking about the traditional designations, but also all natural resources. So next slide, please. As Tom said, one of the key things is that national policy has changed quite significantly recently. At the very top level, Wellbeing and Future Generations Act set out back in 2015 the commitment from Welsh Government to biodiversity by providing them a resilient Wales wellbeing goal. The Environment Act followed in 2016, and this is really significant. Now, you're probably aware that in the Environment Act, the council has a duty which we refer to as the Section 6 duty throughout the document, and that says that the council has a duty to seek to maintain and enhance biodiversity so far as consistent with the proper exercise of their functions. So this applies to all decision making as a council, and that's part of the work that Deb is doing on the Section 6 plan and our wider ways of making decisions in accordance with the Act. But of course, the purpose of the SPG is to try and understand how this duty applies when we are making planning decisions. So the other part of the duty is to promote the resilience of ecosystems, which is why I was explaining on the previous slide the importance of looking at that wider scale. So the next slide is a reminder of how far we have come as a council in understanding how biodiversity is important in the wider agenda of achieving, meeting the climate change issues. So first of all, the duty has been embedded at a regional level. We now have the objective in the wellbeing plan, and we have also successfully put a corporate objective into our corporate plan to ensure that all our decisions maintain and enhance our natural resources and biodiversity. So following that, the local development plan, of course, was adopted in November 2018, and this now includes 3 key policies on biodiversity which seek to implement these commitments into our planning decision making. So we've got 2 policies, one's ER6, one's ER8, and they cover the designated sites, habitats and species. But we've also put into the development plan policy ER9, which looks at ecological networks and features of importance for biodiversity. So again, we're thinking about connectivity, the wider cumulative impact of development. And also, really interestingly, the more you think about biodiversity, it's like a fundamental plank in placemaking and sustainability. So if you achieve maintained and enhanced biodiversity, you're also, as Steve has mentioned, increasing the quality of place. And it could be part of your green infrastructure. The more biodiverse places, the more likely it will adapt to climate change. It certainly is, the more we've experienced lockdown, a biodiverse, green, natural environment has been essential for many people's health and well-being. And then there are kind of more environmental control features, such as the more trees and greenery, it's better for air quality and water quality. So it's quite a wide-ranging SPG that will have effects outside of its obvious direct policy areas. So next slide. So the purpose of this is to take the Section 6 duty and help our developers and applicants and the council as a decision maker to understand how it can achieve the Section 6 duty by maintaining and enhancing biodiversity. So this means that a development should not cause a significant loss. So that's going to relate to your designated and non-designated species and habitats. But it also, and this is where the guidance has gone a step further than we're used to, should provide a net benefit for biodiversity and promote resilience of ecosystems. So this means that we need to be, when we're taking decisions on planning applications, we need to be considering the impacts of development on all features and importance to biodiversity. And when we look at the final development, it should have left that place in a better ecological state than when we began. So that's quite a tricky thing to achieve. So next slide. So chapter 3 of the SPG is where we start getting to the main body of the guidance. It provides a step-by-step guide of how we're going to administer this ecosystem services resilience approach through our planning decisions. So it's a way of embedding Section 6 into the decision-making process. And the guide, the lead we've taken is, as Tom said, PPW has explained, and this has always been there in TAN 5, there was a stepwise approach, as they call it, but it's now centre and upfront in PPW, and it's talking about, if we want to achieve Section 6, then we need to make sure that any adverse environmental effects are firstly avoided and then minimised, that compensated as very last resort, but wherever possible, we should be looking for a development to secure enhancements. So this diagram here is included in chapter 3 of the SPG, and it's trying to get these concepts across, it's almost the fundamental basis of how to think through a development. So we're starting right at the beginning, identify and assess. I think actually we'll move on to the next slide because there we are. So chapter 3 gives the principles of this ecosystem services resilience approach. Chapter 4 then moves on, and we've tried to clearly match each stage of the development control process and show which parts of the stepwise process are applicable at that stage. And one of the key messages that we want to get across is that engagement with the local planning authority, both the planners and the ecologists at the early stage, is the most effective way to integrate biodiversity into your decision making and your final outcomes. So really you should be looking before you've even come to see the planning authority to understand what is on your site, and start to think about your survey process. Pre-application was advised strongly, especially on larger applications, because this is where you can understand what's on the site, ideally avoid any negative effects. If any enhancements or proposals are required, then they can be designed into and integrated into the development. So I think if we explore to the next, I've got a couple of slides here to show you a few screen caps of what the document looks like. So this is chapter 4. It takes each of those steps and tries to give clear guidance of what we will expect the developer to do at that stage to show that they've maintained and enhanced biodiversity. So as I said, early engagement is really important, and that can mean that you can make a development more viable because there'll be no surprises later on. You won't have costly requirements from ecology coming at the final planning consultation response stage. This is all about building biodiversity in, and as we found on the strategic sites, the emerging approach to green infrastructure means that this building in can start to get multifunctional benefits. So if you design an open space, you make sure that it's biodiverse. If you're going through the SAB process and you have to put a pond in, then if you've talked early enough to the ecologists and the LPA, then you can start to make those suds biodiverse. So it's all part of a wider council approach to ensuring we achieve mitigate effects of climate change. So next slide, Andrew. So where we haven't managed to avoid impacts on biodiversity, we're setting out clear steps to show how we would expect mitigation to be proposed. Where this isn't possible, we would be looking for compensation. And it's quite a technical process, and there's a lot of guidance in the background from SEAM and British standards. And so we've set out clearly what the ecologists would expect to be proposed to deliver mitigation and compensation. On the next slide, this is the final stage, and perhaps a stage that normally is overlooked, but it's really important to make sure that we get these biodiversity outcomes. If we're negotiating for features to be provided, then we need to understand if the management plans are effective, if monitoring is in place. And I've missed out a really important stage, which is enhance, which of course is part of the requirement of this Section 6 duty, that we should be maintaining and enhancing biodiversity. I'll come on to that in a second. The next slide is just to give you a flavour of the appendices, which are, we accept, rather lengthy, but to me this is kind of like the engine behind the guidance. So it gives a detailed guidance and survey checklists, which will help both the decision-making process and the applicants understand what's required. Things like there is a ecological survey seasons checklist. So if you get the timing of your surveys right, it can avoid legal action on protected sites. You can make sure that you aren't getting costs and delays at surprising stages of your development process. We did, because it's such a complex and technical area, there was a lot of things that we wanted to provide guidance on, but we recognised that it wasn't pertinent to the planning decision-making process. So quite a lot of information will be provided on the ecology website instead, and that will be things like a guide to marine planning, how to get an NRW licence, what the HRA process is. There's a lot in the background there, so useful to see this SPG as part of a package of guidance. So there was the main document, the appendices with these technical checklists, and then more environmental guidance in the background. Yeah, next slide. Yeah, so enhancement. This is a concept that we've all been trying to understand how this works in the planning process. It's easy to say that you need to maintain and enhance biodiversity, but what does that actually mean? Well, Planning Policy Wales says that you should secure enhancement wherever possible. And so we've been trying through the guidance to explain clearly what does this mean. So in the first instance, the LPA should always seek to, well, we have written in the guidance, sorry, but in the first instance, we'll always seek to integrate biodiversity measures into the design and layout of a site. And similar to this idea of engaging early as possible, it's quite, if you think ahead, it's quite possible to find an enhancement that you can put as part of the design. Like I was saying before, on a small scale, it could just be replacing one brick on a building with a back brick. Or if you're on a larger scale, if you've taken a suds pond, a little bit of thought with the landscaping and planting, you could put in pollinated species, native species, and that's where the enhancement could come from. So when I'm first reading it, can make you a little bit alarmed that maybe there's lots of expensive extra things to be provided, but a good placemaking and design process can build in multifunctional green spaces, which can include biodiversity enhancements. So the SPG is clear that we're looking to integrate. Obviously, it won't always be possible to integrate a biodiversity measure. So there was also clear guidance in the SPG about when we will use either a Section 1 of 6 agreement or a condition to try and secure the enhancements that we think are reasonably related to the development. And so a big, very important concept in trying to negotiate enhancement wherever possible is proportionality. And this is something that has been debated a lot between ecologists and planners at the Welsh Government level as well. Proportionality means that we try and match whatever we ask for to the scale. So like I said, the small scale could just be a back brick, larger scale could be more kind of larger scale requirements. So this is how we make sure that enhancements are compliant with the SIL regulations. Tom and Steve have mentioned the Park Mawr application that went through last week, and this has been a really interesting exercise in terms of biodiversity and green infrastructure to understand how to use the Section 6 duty and make sure that these decisions about new places and green spaces are aligned with our Section 6 duty to maintain and enhance biodiversity. So something that Steve and I have been thinking through a lot is scale. And I know Steve mentioned scale in terms of A and B development. It applies also to placemaking and biodiversity. So landscape scale fits really well with the concept of ecosystem resilience and what we mentioned earlier about the corridors, ponds, stepping stones. It's about looking outside of the site, looking at the cumulative impact and effects and opportunities of development, things like the corridors. So as you can see in the Park Mawr development, we were able to retain hedgerows and woodlands where it was removed. Then you're into the steps of the stepwise process where you're trying to mitigate or replace to compensate. And then, of course, the connectivity of make sure that you've got green connections within and outside the site to the wider ecological value around your site. So the next slide is that middle scale where we've thought a lot more. I think everybody's used to about landscaping and biodiversity, but we started to think at the street scale and be negotiating to get wider street width so we can start to put more tree planting in, get grass verges, make sure those verges are planted with native species or pollinating species. And all of this is back to those varied functions we get from biodiversity of, more bugs, more wet areas, better drainage, air quality, and all of this is plugging in benefits to do with health and well-being through added biodiversity enhancements. So following from the street scale, there's been applications and a lot of thought gone into the plot and the building scale. So at an urban level, there's a lot of opportunities through the city centre green infrastructure project to think of roofs as stepping stones and streets and tree-lined streets as corridors. So we've got the application on the Woolworths Picton Yard building, which has got all sorts of enhancements there. We've got pollinating species, got beehives, greenhouses, street trees, sustainable drainage. So it's a really good example of where you can start with small tweaks, putting in things that will increase the resilience, especially in the city centre, cooler roofs, more shading. And then at the smaller scale, like I said before, you can do swift bricks and improve connectivity by putting hedgehog fencing in. So that's an example of how we should be seeing things change in the implementation of the type of decisions we're making. So final slide, just a recap. Hopefully, if we get this SPG up and running, then we will be having development decisions which will start to implement the principles of sustainable management of natural resources that are all embedded in national legislation. And again, we'll be needing to go to consultation with this, as Tom has explained. So any questions on that at the end, please?
Thanks very much, Rachel, for taking us through that very comprehensive summary of what the document's all about and why it's important. And we do appreciate that there is a lot of information that we're relaying here to members in the presentations, and also that the SPG themselves are, they're hefty documents. But as I mentioned earlier, it's a significant area of planning that has shifted in emphasis in recent years. It's really good that we're keeping up to keeping up to date with these kind of changes and having an up-to-date guidance document that we can refer to as decision makers. The consultation challenges will be the same as before, as in relation to the other document, but we want to work to the same time frame. A September, October consultation ideally, and we want to be coming back to members at the end of the year, then by year's end, and probably in December, by the time we've been through the feedback that we would have had, and offer the final version then for approval. So there is the option here of going through on finishing off the final few slides on the other document. I can see there's lots of questions being posed. Chair, would you like us to continue with the final few slides?
Yes, please. Yeah.
We'll do that then. Rachel, if I can hand over to you to explain and just whiz through some of the final slides here, and perhaps Alan Webster, Council's Tree Officer, can contribute on some of the technical areas.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll try and be quick on these final slides. So just to, as I mentioned earlier, we had a version of this adopted in 2016, and the purpose of the document is to ensure that all of significant existing and proposed trees are kept healthy and become assets to the new development. So it gives basic information on trees, and this term refers to trees, hedgerows and woodlands, and how they will be dealt with in the planning system. So it looks at all stages of development. So we're thinking about what's on before the development occurs, during protection of trees, during construction, what protection measures are required, and also the landscaping elements, what we may want to see planted on a site. So there weren't major amendments required to this document. There were just some tweaks to bring it into line with current policy. The LDP contains policy ER11 now, which is in line with revised PPW, and both documents have got a little bit more information in there, firstly about biodiversity, but also about ancient trees and woodlands and hedgerows. When we decided we needed to update this document, Alan highlighted that it was a useful opportunity to clarify that where a survey flags up category A and B trees, that the council will be expecting those to be incorporated into a development. So that was really one of the main amendments to the document. A few other tweaks in there. We felt the need to cross-reference the emerging SPGs and the council's tree plan. So if you put the next slide on, please, Andrew. Another driver to focus on the tree SPG at this stage is the really high profile that trees have had recently in Swansea. There's definitely a greater public awareness of the importance of trees, and we're having increased public scrutiny when we do new development sites. So either on our own schemes, or developers are also finding that there's increasing pressure to either protect the trees on the site or ensure quality landscaping, which includes trees on their new development. I think also we've got an increased corporate understanding of how important it is to how trees are very important to delivering our climate change and our ecology commitments. And as I said, it's part of the green infrastructure strategy to increase tree canopy cover. That will be one of the targets in the final strategy, to make sure that trees are an important part of our GI in the city centre. Again, trees and lockdown, getting out into the open air and being able to experience the natural environment is just increasingly on the public and political agendas. And of course, we've had recent issues of unlawful removal of protected trees on site. So it's really important to get this SPG into place and have clear planning guidance. But also, Alan is working on a draft Swansea Council tree plan, which looks at things outside of the planning process to also include how the council is going to manage and maintain its own trees and trees in private ownership. So the next slide is just to give another reason why it's so important to get this SPG in place. So I think probably everybody appreciates how important trees are, but I think this slide just demonstrates how multifunctional and biodiverse and part of the ecosystem network a tree can be, whether it's a street tree or a tree in the open countryside. So right through cultural heritage value, placemaking value, ecological, environmental, economic benefits. So I'm sure you're all aware of that already. Next slide. Right, so this is just to highlight what has been changed. So as I said, we've got it's guidance now that fits with our policy R11 in the LDP, and it fits with the change in policy context to do with Section 6 duty, so to make sure that decisions we make about trees align with the Section 6 duty. And on the right hand side is the section in Chapter 4 now, which explains exactly what we will expect where category A and B trees are identified on the site, usually be expected to be incorporated into the layout, and also some guidance on C and U trees, which have significant features. They will be expected to be retained if it's not hazardous. So next slide. It's just an idea of the content of the SPG. Split it into 3 general themes. The SPG will give you guidance on how to retain trees, so it's a lot of signposts in there to best practice, British standards and guidance, so applicants can understand what surveys are required or what methods of protection they will need to submit, protection plans, method statements. It also lists all the considerations that you should take into account if you have trees on your site during the design stages. So again, it's about integrating and designing in and thinking in advance. And there's also specific guidance in there about how you should deal with woodlands and veteran trees and hedgerows. So on the next slide, just a bit of an idea of the type of information that is in there about how to keep trees healthy. So one of the objectives of the document is to make sure they become assets to the new developments, part of placemaking. Of course, that means you don't want to damage trees during construction, and you need to make sure any trees that you've retained or indeed plant have proper root protection zones, and that the soil quality is right to allow the tree to grow to maturity. Next slide. Yeah, and the third theme of the guidance is about landscaping and new tree planting. So the SPG recognises the many functions of trees planted on sites and that they may enhance amenity. They may be required on the site if you're trying to mitigate the loss of tree canopy cover, and of course the sense of place and well-being. There's also guidance, technical guidance in there about British standards and other guidance about how to plant trees effectively on a new site, again, so that they can grow healthily into maturity. So that's the final slide in summary. Again, it's this, a key emerging theme in planning and politically. There's a lot of new legislation that this SPG will help us make decisions in accordance with. And yeah, back over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Rachel. Tom's muted.
Thank you, Rachel. I'll hand directly over to the chair at this point because I think we want to move to questions.
Yeah, I do have a number of speakers, but first I'm going to invite Councillor Peter Jones, is biodiversity champion. Peter, would you like to address the committee with your 3 minutes, please?
That's very kind of you, Paul, and I'm grateful to you and to the committee for inviting me to attend and participate in this afternoon's discussion. Obviously, particularly this agenda item is of central interest and importance to me, not only as biodiversity champion for the council, but also because I chair the Natural Environment Biodiversity Scrutiny Panel, which we created back last summer, and has a responsibility for overseeing and holding to account the council in relation to its management of the natural environment and biodiversity. Some of you will know that I previously worked as a policy officer with the RSPB for about 15 years and was engaged with a number of environmental policy issues, particularly climate change and sustainable development. Can I say I'm very impressed by this consultation document? Very detailed, very comprehensive, very encouraging. And I'm really grateful to those involved in its drafting. I think it will take the council a long way in terms of embedding a better understanding and a fuller understanding of responsibilities under both the Wellbeing Act in 2015 and the Environment Act of 2016. Indeed, dare I say, I was responsible for drafting the wording for Resilient Wales in the Wellbeing Act and was heavily involved with the wording in the Section 6 duty in the Environment Act. So I've got a very personal as well as broader interest in seeing that this legislation is properly delivered. Members will know that we had a natural environment scrutiny inquiry into Swansea's management of its environment and biodiversity responsibilities back in 2018 and into 2019. And one of the concerns that came out of that particular inquiry was with the adequacy of the planning control on the management and monitoring of ecological requirements built into planning approvals. And there was some concern that because of loss of staff and maybe other considerations, that whilst requirements are written into planning consents, the capacity to monitor and the delivery of those requirements may have not always been as good as one might have wanted it to be. But we've been very pleased because out of that, one of our recommendations was the appointment of a new planning ecologist into Deb Hill's team. And of course, that person is now in post full time. And a further recommendation of the inquiry panel was to create and appoint a Section 6 biodiversity officer. And again, the most recent budget, I believe, has given financial provision for the appointment of just such a person, although that post has not yet, mainly because of COVID, been filled. So I'm hopeful that whilst the inquiry panel was nervous and concerned about the capacity of planning to monitor and control ecological requirements, that we are putting in place, have put in place, will put in place a kind of starting resource capacity that we think is needed to deliver on those. If I may, Chair, just mention one further factor. We haven't said much about the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981, the UK legislation. Yes, we're right to talk about Welsh legislation, but let's not forget the 1981 Act. And the reason I say that is because I've had a number of cases recently where, in particular in relation to the protection of breeding wild birds during the March to August nesting season, there have been incidents where the protections have not been observed. And what I found, consulting with the police and others, how difficult in fact it is to enforce this kind of legislation. And I know that's not strictly a planning concern issue, but of course it is a development issue, because in the cases concerned, the clearance of trees and hedgerows was a preliminary step in terms of development process. And I'm afraid that the wildlife legislation was proving impossible to enforce, not through anyone's fault in this council, but because it's less than the legislation itself is too vague in terms of the conditions that need to be met. So I'll stop at that point. I'm aware that I'm constrained by time, but again, I'd like to thank the committee. I think this SPG is going to prove very, very useful. My panel will no doubt have a look at it in the autumn as part of the consultation process, and we'll let the committee have its views. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Next speaker then, Councillor Louise Gibbard.
Oh, thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to echo a lot of what Councillor Jones has just said and thank the officers for the documents and the presentation. I think they look really, really useful, very clear, very user friendly, and I really like that stepwise guide. I think it's going to really promote better awareness of these important issues in planning applications going forward. So thank you very much. I'm really supportive of the documents.
Indeed, thank you. Councillor Mike Lewis.
Yes, I'm all for what has been proposed in this SPG and forwarding it to consultation and for the retention of more trees. But what I can gather is to propose to include A and B category trees on new developments. My question is, by increasing the number of retained trees, are we going to dissuade developers on certain sites from using those sites as they become unaffordable to develop? This is a major change to policy, and I have reservations on the inclusion of C and U trees, as some sites that we have passed over the last few years would not have even been built because of the amount of C and G trees on those sites. So I would like Tom to give me a reply on that, please.
Okay, we'll come back to that at the end. All right then. Councillor Will Evans.
Right, you hear me?
Yes.
Question for Rachel, just a bit of clarity. In relation to Swift bricks, I've never heard that before, and I saw the illustration on his slide. Tell me the main purpose of that. Is it for feeding or nesting or whatever? Second point, in relation to the duty to keep trees healthy, how do we propose to do that? In other words, at the moment, have we got a policy in place where we got a tree inspection process? Because that's a big ask to ensure that trees are kept healthy. Whose duty would that be? If there's a TPO on a piece of land owned by an individual, would that individual have a responsibility to do it? So a bit of clarity on those 2 points, please.
Yeah, okay, we'll come back to you. Councillor Mike White.
Yes, thank you, Chair. 2 points, if I could, Chair. Can we, as part of the stepwise approach, we mentioned about having connections with developers and dialogue. Would it be possible, part of an application pack, to perhaps include within this policy that this would be one of the issues that developers will have to look at, and pack with information of the appropriate departments and agencies that the developer would have to engage with? Yeah. And secondly, in regards to the issue of of developments, we have some developments which obviously backs onto land which is in private ownership. Over the past has caused a lot of problems where the private owner will not take responsibility for the upkeep of these areas of land and is blighting the land. Is it possible perhaps we can have built within this policy that we would perhaps hold these private organisations to account, NRW, Network Rail, prime one is obviously the Duke of Beaufort, but perhaps if that could be included within the policy, Chair. Thank you.
You come back with some advice on that then. Okay. Thank you. Councillor Des Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Planning legislation precludes the SPG from introducing new policy. That's included in the minutes. Can somebody explain that? Is it that these are not new policies? These are polishing up then of our existing policies and creating guidelines for them to be followed. The other question I have is on trees. We all know that we have many, many trees on our own land without TPOs. Will this make any difference to that policy that we already have? Or can we in the future see this protection given to our own trees? Because as everyone knows, we've been caught out over the years on various occasions where we dispose of parcels of land and omit to put tree preservation order on them, and they are quickly, removed from the landscape. Two questions. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And my last, Councillor Mary Jones.
Thank you, Chair. I think Councillor Thomas is referring to a very famous tree in his ward where we lost it to not having a TPO from when we sold the land. I have had this conversation with Alan previously, and I did bring it up about Park Mawr on Friday. It's all very well saying we're protecting trees and planting trees, but I am really keen that we make sure we know what trees we're agreeing with developers are going into people's gardens. I'm not talking about on the street or in the woodland nearby, but trees, if they're small ones, they take a very long time to grow and they cause major problems. We have had people coming back and asking us to, if they can have the TPO removed or if they can do work on the trees. So we must be very mindful that I fully support having trees. I've got loads and loads, like most of us, in my ward, and plant them as soon as I can if we get any money. But I am concerned that not everybody wants trees. So make sure that we only have small trees if they're actually in people's properties when we're, agreeing these new big sites, for example.
Okay, fair enough. No other hands up? No. Right, some questions there and comments for. Is it for Rachel or Tom?
Yes, thanks, Chair. I'll cover things first of all, to say thank you to Councillor Gibbard for her expressing her support on the guidance, much appreciated, and for others that have done so as well. In terms of this issue of the category A and B trees, I think the significant thing to highlight is that what the SPG is seeking to do is to identify that they should be retained where proposals don't require their removal, and that we would normally expect them to be incorporated. So it's seeking to put ourselves on that setting before we enter into the negotiations on the specific nature of the scheme, to decide whether or not those other categories of trees really need to be removed as part of the development that's being proposed. So it doesn't mean that they will always, in every case, have to be retained, but I think it's reorientating things a bit so that we start from the right setting. This just moving on to the issue of the Councillor Thomas and Councillor Jones have both raised in respect of protecting trees that aren't already covered by TPOs. I think it's a really important one, and there is an option which I think we should follow for during the consultation process to ask a specific question on this as to whether that is something that could be integrated into the document to provide the mechanism for TPOs to be in place, or trees to be clearly established as protected at the time when planning permission is given, or when there is a move towards the disposal of a site or so on. Basically, what I think we need to move towards is a system where we are able to have a clarity on those streets that are not within the public highway, those that are not covered by the adoption, and if there are some within proposed to be within private gardens of a new consented estate or residential development, then we can look for the right sort of mechanism to cover those by a protection order. And if it isn't significant, if it isn't clearly spelt out in the document enough, then that's a specific question we can raise during the consultation to seek feedback on. Whether Alan wants to add anything in terms of what the statutory process that might be available to do that could be helpful.
Yeah, we've been looking at TPO in trees that have been planted as part of the landscaping condition. One of the sites that Councillor Jones refers to, some of the trees in the gardens, the residents thought they were too big a species, whereas the landscape architect thought they were suitable for the site, and that's why they were planted and subsequently protected. The other land with trees that needs protecting in these larger developments is where we're not adopting the land, and it's being looked after by a management company. Apart from that, I think it's worth asking the question, because it can be a bit of a shock to developers if we go and do it afterwards without any sort of prior notification that this may happen.
Yeah. Thank you, Alan. Right, okay, anyone else? Are all questions answered for you? Yes? Okay, I know nobody. Oh, sorry.
My two questions, the Swift Bricks and the. Can I just ask a quick question of Alan?
Yeah.
Isn't it normal process in the planning process for a tree survey to be carried out, especially on big sites, so that we know at an early stage what trees are there? I mean, at what point does a tree survey kick in? It should be part of our policy that we do it at an early stage. So where are we with that?
Yes, obviously we only get to hear about it when we have a pre-app or an application. What the developer should be doing is having a tree survey done right at the start, so they can plan around the trees, see how the site can be enhanced by the existing trees. And that's the manner they should work. That's the manner the British Standard says they should work, and hence the retention of the A and B tip trees. And following on from the question about retaining A and B trees, if there was a really nice A or even B tree blocking an entrance to a site and preventing development wholesale, it would be clearly unreasonable to insist we keep that. Whereas if it's one, it means a redesign and a loss of one unit in a development of 150 houses. It's admittedly a bit of profit for the developer, but it's more reasonable to retain that tree then.
Yeah, just one finally on a pre-application process. Surely that should be insisted on the developer that we need it. So, we need to. That's where we need to hit it.
It's that's one of the sticking points of the pre-app process, is that if I don't get a tree survey to comment on, I give general comments on what trees I've seen either by attending site or looking at a Google Earth or aerial view, that runs a risk of them felling trees prior to development. And I have TPO trees following a pre-app and a negative comment from myself to prevent them felling those trees to remove my likely objection.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Alan. Councillor Mary Jones, you wanted to come back in.
Tom's, I haven't answered my 2 questions.
Oh, sorry.
They've been answered in the chat about.
No, they haven't. The Swift.
No, those Councillor Evans, you had a specific question on the use of the Swift bricks.
No, I asked 2 questions, so I'm not going to repeat them. What's the answers to them?
There's a question on Swift bricks, and I have to confess, I've always.
Sorry?
On the Swift. On the question on Swift bricks, I need to confess that I assume that they're for nesting, but if Deb wants to come in to correct me on that.
Yeah, that's right. They are for nesting. Swifts are in quite serious decline, and they do tend to nest mainly in urban areas. And because a lot of modern buildings don't have the same sort of spaces for them to build their nests, if you can actually build bricks in as a new build, that's providing opportunities for them to come back into our towns and cities. And I think in Oxford, they're actually called Oxford Swift City, because they've had a project which has been really, really popular with local residents to bring a whole load of Swifts back into the centre of the city.
See. Thank you. All right, Emma?
No, what's the other one? Keep trees healthy. Why have I got to ask this again? I've asked the question.
No, I'm going to answer.
Yeah.
There's a section in the SPG on Chapter 8 which explains that, as well as there will be conditions to place which ensure that if a tree becomes unhealthy or dies within 5 years completion of development, it will be replaced by a new tree. So it will be part of the conditions. I think Alan may have mentioned conditioning. Is that
No,
correct?
what you mentioned, Rachel, is a duty for trees to be kept healthy. I think that's the word you use. Is that correct or not? Because if it is, it's a big ask. I don't know whose responsibility is it if the tree is in somebody's garden, for instance, that they got a duty to keep that tree healthy. Is that correct?
The TPO system keeps trees healthy in respect that they can't be mutilated or damaged. If they become diseased or die and are removed because they're in that state, there is a requirement under the TPO legislation that they need to be replaced. So that's how the TPO legislation fits into that keeping trees healthy in an planned environment.
Okay. Yeah.
Not convinced, but there you are.
Councillor Mary Jones, and then Ian wants to come in.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I've misunderstood this, or we're not putting our point over correctly, and this is in relation to what Councillor Thomas said. There was one I remember, and it wasn't a monkey puzzle tree. This was another tree in West Cross when we sold land, and there were no TPOs on any trees. It's happened probably everywhere else. But
they were
what we're trying to make is, I know you said about the pre-app and the trees, but we've got no TPOs on these trees when that land is sold. Is there any way we can actually make it far more difficult for them to be cut down before they can get planning permission to take the chance and they cut the tree down and just hope they get the planning permission?
Okay. Should I answer, Tom? We've had one site recently where the council's disposed of it, and prior to that going through, we've TPO'd trees on the site. I am being contacted more and more by estates, and hopefully this will become embedded with the tree policy that hopefully will be finished and adopted in due course.
Yeah, I think that's where it's useful just to, as a reminder of the two documents in relation to protection of trees here. The one which is the council tree policy, which Alan was referring to there, a corporate document about what we will do with trees in terms of protecting them on the land which is under our control, and then this, which is obviously the separate piece of planning guidance which applies to all.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Ian.
Thank you, Chair. Just in response to Councillor Evans's query about tree surveys, where a development proposal will affect trees, it is a validation requirement that a tree survey has to be submitted. So the application cannot be processed without the tree survey. So that would enable us to consider the implications of those trees as part of the application process. I think, as Alan mentioned, there's no requirement at pre-app stage to do it, but certainly where tree surveys are not submitted as part of a pre-app inquiry, we will advise developers at our application stage they will need to submit one.
Right.
Yeah, good.
Okay. No, nobody else. Rachel, did you want to come back in? No.
No, all right.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? No. All right. Well done. Excellent presentation and discussion there. Now then, do we take these two separately, folks?
What's on the page, Jim? I haven't got one in front of me.
Yeah, but they are. Where are we? One is development and biodiversity, and the other is trees, hedgerows, and woodland.
No, so it's all the same, isn't it? Yeah.
Right, take it as one, is it? Okay.
Let's have a look. Let's have a look.
Like
no, it's the same. It's all in one recommendation. Yeah.
Okay. So right then, we will now then proceed to the vote on the recommendation there that they be the purpose of public consultation. We will.
Yep. Councillor Anderson.
Approve.
Councillor Black.
No.
Councillor Peter Black.
4.
Thank you. Will Evans.
Approve.
Louise Gibbard.
Approve.
Mary Jones.
Approve.
Mike Lewis.
Approve.
Richard Lewis.
Approval.
Paulette, no present. Des Thomas.
Sorry, somebody muted me. Approve, Chair.
Yep. Cheers. Linda Taylor, not present. Mike White.
Approve.
Thank you. Paul Lloyd.
Approve.
There's 10 unanimous again.
Unanimous again. Yeah, thank you all. And I must say, I've been impressed with the contributions this afternoon and the presentations. So, thank you all very much. And let's go enjoy. Thank you. Let's go enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Bye all.
Right.